On behalf of Arte Público Press, recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Program and USLDH, we welcome you to this talk. As many of you know, Arte Público Press and Recovery, two important forces in the field of U.S. Latino studies, were founded and are directed by Dr. Nicolás Canelos. His vision to establish the nonprofit press and the historical archival program stemmed from a social justice need to document the legacy of the Latino, Latina, Latinx culture, language, and literature in the United States. To date, Arte Público Press has published over 600 books that include fiction, nonfiction, YA, and children's literature. And Recovery has located over 1,400 newspapers and digitized thousands of records that document the presence of the Latinx people in the land that we now know as the United States. The social justice need continues to this day as we fight against the erasure of our bodies and language on a daily basis. Therefore, the need to create a program that could use these resources for digital scholarship was and is imminent. My colleague, Dr. Carolina Villarroel, Brown Foundation Director of Research at Recovery, who is unable to join us this afternoon, but it's an important force in this. She and I began the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Program a few years ago with the support from Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who are sponsors of this talk. And for that, I must acknowledge the support of Patricia Shui in this. And we are happy to report that we have made important strides in this field. We have grown our team to include Dr. Lorena Gautreau, who you all may probably have run into quite a bit on social media, who's our spearheads that for us, and Dr. Linda Garcia Merchant, who just joined us a couple of years ago and is already reinforcing and empowering our team incredibly. And together we organize talks and workshops on the age and the age and social justice, present on conferences across the US, train and mentor students from all academic levels, as well as community members on US Latino DH practice, create digital projects and databases. In the past 18 months, we awarded 16 grants for people across the United States to do US Latino digital scholarship projects, and this training has solidified our USLDH mission to continue working and supporting research on this legacy that has been lost, absent, repressed, or underrepresented. And I'm happy to see that some of our grantees are here with us today. I invite you to visit our website, artepublicopress.com, for more information, to follow us on social media, to use the hashtag USLDH, to live tweet our lectures, and to tweet about US Latino DH. And of course, if you can, please donate to Arte Público Press, or we are a nonprofit publishing company that all the money that we raise is put into the production of new and more books, and also into the research projects. And then if you don't want to, or you can donate to Arte Público Press, please support your small and local publishing companies, because the work that independent publishing houses do is crucial to ethnic studies. Before I introduce Dr. Figeroa-Vásquez today, I would like to go over the logistics for the Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat function to type in your questions. And then after the lecture, I will share your questions with Dr. Figeroa-Vásquez so that she can answer them. And lastly, please don't forget to mute yourselves to cut down on any background noise. Now, let's get on to what we're here for today. The greatness of Dr. Yomaira Figeroa-Vásquez, who I think we are so honored that she accepted our offer to bring, to chat with us today, to present on her work. When we reached out and did a little bit of research on who to bring to these talks, we've been following her work for quite a bit and are fascinated to see the different ways in which the work that she's doing really feeds into some of the work that we've been doing at Arte Público Press and Recovery. Dr. Yomaira Figeroa-Vásquez is an Afro-Puerto Rican writer, teacher, and scholar. She is Associate Professor of Global Afro-Diaspora Studies at Michigan State University and the author of Decolonizing Diasporas, Radical Mappings of Afro-Atlantic Literature. Please buy her book. Her published work can be found in Hypatia, Decolonization, Centro Journal, Small Acts, Frontiers Journal, Hispanophilia, Contemporánea, and XX Salon. She is founder of the MSU Women of Color Initiative, hashtag Proyecto Palabras PR, MSU Muse, and the digital material project Taller Electric Marronage. The title of her talk today is Afro-Latinx Studies in Afro-Atlantic Contexts, Weaving Digital and Material Practices. So I give Dr. Figeroa-Vásquez the word now, and let's listen to her.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to share that before I opened it up. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I want to thank the USLDH and also Arte Público Press for making it possible for me to be here. I'm really excited to share some of my work with you today. And I'm also thankful for everyone who made time amid all the chaos that's happening right now to join us in this talk. My name is Yomaira Figeroa-Vásquez, and I am going to talk today a little bit about my book, and then I'm going to shift to talking about community-informed digital and material practices and programming and some of the new directions of my work. So I'm going to start here and try to figure out this thing here. Okay, so usually when I start my talks, I like to start with this slide that gives a little bit of a glimpse into who I am and how I come to the work that I do. I am a first generation Afro-Puerto Rican, raised in Hoboken, New Jersey. My parents are from Vega Baja in Caguas, Puerto Rico. I'm also a first generation high school graduate and college graduate and so on. I attended Rutgers University as an undergrad where I majored in English, Puerto Rican studies, and women's and gender studies. And I earned my Ph.D. at UC Berkeley in comparative ethnic studies, which essentially was a program that brought together those kind of undergraduate interests in literature, Puerto Rican studies and diaspora studies, and feminist and gender studies. And I'm currently an associate professor at Michigan State. I am really so interested in our journeys as folks of color, as professors of color, as Black women in the academy, in particular because we are often trained that to be a true scholar is to be objective and to have or to move towards a universal view, when in reality we are deeply affected by our upbringing, our cultures, our languages, our stories. And for me, it's important to situate this within this context of being, in this kind of having this diasporic experience, this kind of diasporic dislocation, and making home in many places and having that shape my worldview. And while my project that I'm about to talk to you right now, Decolonizing Diaspora, is not specifically about the Afro-Puerto Rican experience, and not specifically about like this slide here, it is really important for me to note that the kinds of experiences that I had growing up in a working poor family in Hoboken, New Jersey, really shaped the kinds of questions and the kinds of ways that I approached the questions, what stories I thought were important, and who I believed when it came to the things that I was reading, and what kinds of knowledge I valued. And I hope that those kinds of things are important to you all as well, right? And so just like a really quick thing, there's the photos at the bottom of the photo, at the bottom of the slide are a photo of me and my father at my first grade graduation. And my father went to school to the 3rd grade. And so for my family, this first grade graduation was a really big deal. And he had passed away by the time I graduated my PhD, but the other photo is me and my mother at my PhD graduation at UC Berkeley some years ago. And so I hadn't actually thought about the kind of photos that I selected in that way, but every time I kind of present it, it comes to mind that the kind of graduation, that like the seeking of knowledge and the study of this work has become so important, even as perhaps my family doesn't always grasp exactly what I'm doing. And so that has become really an important part of how I take up the space that I do in the academy and the work that I do. So, okay, now that you know a little bit about me and maybe a little too much, I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about my first book, Decolonizing Diasporas, Radical Mappings of Afro-Atlantic Literature. And this is kind of like a general overview. So in this book, I'm looking specifically at the experiences of Afro-Puerto Rican, Afro-Cuban, and Afro-Dominican writers, artists, cultural workers in the diaspora, and their relationship to Spanish-speaking Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically looking at Guinea Equatorial or Equatorial Guinea, and their cultural productions, music, and writing in the diaspora in Spain. In doing so, I was really interested in bringing together a conversation of folks who are necessarily peripheralized oftentimes in our discourses and even in our imagination. So thinking about specifically, I'm building in here when I'm thinking about periphery on the work of Silvio Torres and Ramon Hernandez and the Dominican Americans, where they talk about how if quote unquote Latinos are marginalized and Dominicans are peripheral to that margin, for the simple fact that, especially in the late 90s when they're writing this book, Dominican studies didn't have the impact that it has today, right? They're definitely a group of folks who are relegated to the margins or to the periphery of the conversation when it came to Latinidad. For me, I thought that that was a really interesting position, right? It brings us to thinking about world systems theory, core periphery, and all these other things, but also the materiality, the real experience, right, of falling outside of a series of discourses. And so for me, thinking about Afro-Puerto Rican and Afro-Cuban and Afro-Dominican works, particularly literary and cultural works, became a really important part of figuring out what it means to put folks who are often put on the outside, on the outskirts of marginalized, right, groups in conversation with each other. How can they illuminate for us different aspects of well-worn themes and different ways of thinking about liberation, resistance, colonization, etc. The same thing goes for Guinea Equatorial. It wasn't until I was in graduate school that I first read and encountered a novel written by an Ecuadorian writer, Donato Ndongo's Las Señoras de tu Memoria Negra. And right away, I was really impacted by the kind of resonances that I saw across these experiences, as African experiences in relation to other African novels, but also in relationship to the Afro diaspora writ large. And also thinking about the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the ways in which these discourses never really met each other. And so because this literature in Equatorial Guinea is the only one written in Spanish in Sub-Saharan Africa, it is oftentimes kind of taken away out of or not included in discourses around African literature, because a lot of it is produced in Spain. It is not necessarily seen as Spanish literature, even though it's published there, right? It is often seen as an excess of that canon, even as Ecuadorianos are colonial subjects of Spain. And oftentimes, Guinea Equatorial is not necessarily discussed in African studies, and definitely not in Black studies, often not in Latinx studies, but it is discussed oftentimes in linguistic studies. So it's really interesting to think about why the Spanish language there has become such a prime area for study, right? The kind of ways in which folks were looking at the connections between the dialects in Guinea Equatorial and these Cuban or Caribbean influences, which for me was really interesting to read these to then unearth these longer histories of crossings. So to make a long story short, I was first really interested in these linguistic connections and the ways that these folks are writing through and about decolonization and doing so in colonial languages, English, Spanish, right, Spanglish, etc. And I was also interested in the ways that languages of resistance and Indigenous languages were surfacing, right, through these works. When it came time to shift from the dissertation to the book, I was really excited to look and to trace what were the resonances between these works, and also to trace the long histories of connection between the Caribbean and Guinea Equatorial. So tracing back to, for example, the 19th century penal colony in Guinea Equatorial for Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Filipino anti-colonial activists who'd be kidnapped and brought to Fernando Po to a penal colony there. Or the history of 19th century emancipated Cuban slaves, emancipados, who were promptly then deported to Fernando Po. And I'll show you a map of Fernando Po in a second so you can see this location. And so for me, it was a question of thinking about how can we conceive of relationality, of relations across the Atlantic, across Afro-diasporic peoples, across Afro-Latinx and Afro-Hispanophone peoples who are hardly ever put into relation with one another, hardly put into conversation with one another. And when we do, right, engage in that relation, what do they point us to? How can they instruct us, right, in the kind of everyday acts of resistance, or even in illuminating for us different ways of thinking about our condition in modernity? So this is a GIS map that was made by one of my students for me. So she was able to kind of pinpoint and to show the kind of expanse of the geography. On the one hand, down here, I don't think you can see my mouse if I move it around, but we can see that here in West Africa, this kind of square and then like a bright yellow little island, that is Equatorial Guinea. And I'll show you a close-up map in a minute. And we're looking at that movement in the production of these works and music and dramas and plays in Spain. And on the other end, we see the Caribbean and the US in a map that we're much more used to looking at, right? And seeing that move and specifically, it just turned out that a lot of the work that I was looking at was being produced on the Northeast. And so here's a close-up of the map. Again, a map that we are very used to seeing, Cuba, Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. So we see these archipelagos. And on the other side, we see these islands of Equatorial Guinea and the piece of the continent. So Equatorial Guinea is a piece of the continental swath. It's between Cameroon and Gabon, so between Francophone and Lusophone nation states. And then it also has 5 islands. The island that is marked Bioko is the island that used to be called Fernando Po during the colonial era, both the kind of Portuguese and then the Spanish colonial era. And it was also the island where the penal colony was located and where the emancipated Cuban slaves were sent. Equatorial Guinea has 4 other islands, including Eloe Grande and Eloe Chico, which are mostly uninhabited, Corisco, which is inhabited mostly or autochthonous to the Ndoe, and then Anabon, which is all the way cast down at the bottom. And this is probably one of the only maps, again, a GIS map that was, that shows Anabon on a map of Equatorial Guinea. Because Anabon is so far, far away, it's often rendered either out of the scope of it or completely invisible because it's such a small island. And that is the autochthonous island of the Anabones. And Anabon was originally a Portuguese colony before it was consolidated into the Spanish colony after 1898. In 1898, for those of us who do Latinx studies and do American studies, know that it becomes a really important year, particularly when it comes to understanding US imperialism and the effects of manifest destiny in the 19th century, because we know that after the Spanish-American War, Spain loses all of its remaining colonies, right, in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, or I guess in the Caribbean. And it's in that moment that they signed the Treaty of Paris, that they turn around and sign a second Treaty of Paris in West Africa, which allows them to consolidate all of these islands and the piece of the continent, and then to fully recolonize Equatorial Guinea from 1898 until their administrative decolonization, right? And so we can, in 1968. So we can actually see the direct connection between US imperialism and colonialism and the shift between the loss of these colonies in the Caribbean, specifically Puerto Rico and Cuba, and then the shift to recolonize Guinea Equatorial as a desire to still have some type of semblance of power, right? And so what we see here, for me, it's really exciting to be able to kind of see these maps and to render these places that are often so scattered far apart, visible and near each other, and also to recognize the closeness of a place like Sao Tome and Príncipe, or the former Portuguese colonies, of which Anabon was one. And so in the book, there's a kind of moment where I'm tracing the kind of contention around Spanish and Portuguese takeover of this particular place and the kinds of resistance undertaken by the Nabones. Okay, so all that to say, I'm showing lots of maps, lots of islands, and because this work started to become so much about islands, I was really moved to think about archipelagos and archipelago studies, really informed by the work being done in archipelago studies, particularly in Oceania, particularly by folks in Hawaii, in Guam, the Marianas, and thinking about particularly the work of Epeli Haufa in his book, Our Sea of Islands, where he talks about the different kind of worldviews that become important in thinking about oneself from the position of an island versus from what Craig Santos Perez calls the imperial terra archipelago, right? Or the quote unquote mainland, right? And so one kind of incredible thing that Pali Haufa comes to terms with is that the kind of colonial powers in the Pacific understood all of these Pacific islands as many islands in the sea, but that in the kind of cosmology of indigenous people of Oceania, they understood themselves as a sea of islands, right? And thereby really remapping, right, and rethinking and really challenging these imperial cartographies, and instead thinking about the ocean as an extension of the land and ways of seafaring as connecting and relating to one another. In this map, which is from a book called New York Nonstop Metropolis, it's called Of Islands and Other Mothers. And what we see here is the islands of the Caribbean put together with the islands of New York City, really rendering visible one of the things that we know in Latinx studies, right? One of the things that we kind of talk about, particularly in Latinx Caribbean studies, which is the Caribbean, or New York, Miami, Chicago, these other places of points north are extensions of the Caribbean, and bringing that in a way that we can see the kinds of impacts of migration and population and culture and language in this map. And so for me, there's so many ways for us to kind of read and be instructed by a map like this. But more importantly, I've just shown you a series of different maps, a series of different cartographies, a series of different approaches to thinking about how we understand ourselves in relation to geography, in relation to others, and in relation to our own place. And in fact, many of the novels that I study in decolonizing diasporas also take up the question of, islands, place, belonging, and geography, right? And for me, that has become really important in thinking about how we understand ourselves against the kinds of maps and mappings and cartographies that modernity has imposed on us, right? And how we can think differently about our relations and thereby map ourselves differently in our physical world in relationship to one another. So that digital kind of mapping allows us, and the digital kind of remapping allows us to then imagine differently what we can do in our lives, constructive to us, right? Okay, so show you that map. And so then one of the things that I wanted to kind of mention, because I'm talking about this project on relationality, I'm building on the work of Caribbean scholars, particularly the work of Caribbean feminist scholars like M. Jackie Alexander, Audre Lorde, and I'm also building on the work of Edouard Glissant and some of the Creolite, who also talked about relationality, right? As not built on exception, right? It's about shared differences. But one of the things that I had to be really careful, in particular, looking at a project that was really crossing the scope, that was really looking at Afro-Latinx studies and Afro-Hispanophone studies in these kind of larger Afro-Atlantic contexts, was I had to be really careful to not try to collapse these kinds of experiences, these languages, these peoples, cultures, right? All collapse them into a singular category of Blackness, right? Or a singular category of African or Afro-descendant that wouldn't pay attention to those differences that become really important to recognize and to acknowledge, right? And so for me, building this framework of the critical cartographies of racialization allowed me to better engage in the kind of ethical questions. So I'll explain one, for example. So in the literature of Guinea Equatorial, what we see is a kind of robust discussion of colonialism, post-colonialism, dictatorship, right? Homophobia. We have all sorts of understandings of violence and also oral histories and worldviews. However, these are all being produced and written by folks of different ethnic origins, right? Different ethnicities. And so in Guinea, the dictator of Equatorial Guinea is of a particular clan. He's Fang of the Mongomo clan. And there are multiple ethnic groups. They can be Fang, Ndowe, Bubi, Anobones, right? And so those kinds of differences are really important. So if you're reading a particular novel from Guinea Equatorial, it's important that you know what the ethnic group is of the person who's writing it, because you need to be attentive to the kinds of hierarchies that are active, the kinds of power dynamics, the kinds of land theft, genocide attempts, right? Like those things are important, so that if you attempt to read these all as anti-colonial or all as novels that that indict structures of power or try to read them all with the same kind of, with the same swift pen, then what you're doing is erasing, right, some of the struggles and the kinds of things that are happening that become really important within the context of Equatorial Guinea. Those things become quote unquote less important when they're produced in the diaspora, because, you know, in Spain, no one is saying like, oh, well, this from Equatorial Guinea is produced by someone who's Ndoe. And so as a result, this is the reading that I have. However, in engaging writers from Guinea Equatorial, for them, it was really important for me to state and to be clear about who's writing what and what perspective that meant, right? On the other hand, I was really interested in that kind of shift, right? That shift where those ethnic differences that are so important within Equatorial Guinea, those indigenous languages, those cultures, those practices, and the kind of tensions and violences that occur, then become less important in the diaspora, right? How they then become painted with the same kind of broad swath as all being African or all being from outside of Spain, not Spanish subjects, right? And then for me, I started to think on the other side in the Caribbean, what does it mean to be a Black Latina, to be Black Puerto Rican, Afro-Boricua, Afro-Cuban, or Afro-Dominican, and the ways in which, for example, the legacy of mestizaje, right? The legacy of racial mixing, the quote unquote idea that, you know, your race doesn't matter, we're all Puerto Rican, or we're all Dominican, or we're all Cuban, and that is what makes us, right, who we are vis-a-vis a global superpower like the United States that works within the context of hypodescent, the one-drop rule, right? And at the same time, we know that our nations, our cultures, and these places are deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, right? So on the one hand, you can say like, you know, it doesn't matter, we're all Puerto Rican, pero ella tiene el pelo malo. Oh, it doesn't matter, we're all Puerto Rican, pero ella es negra pero linda, you know? Oh, it doesn't matter, you know, we're all Cuban, pero cada oveja con su pareja, right? And so we can think about the ways that these things imbue, right? And really touch us in a very deep way. And then when we think about the diaspora, we think about the clashing, right? The kind of bringing together of multiple racial ideologies, right? And the kinds of ways that you can be confronted with multiple forms of anti-Blackness, both of them trying to obfuscate one another, both of them trying to prove that they're not as bad as the other, right? And at the same time, for us, it's important to understand that they're equally, right, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, and that they're both this kind of setup, right? So for me, trying to hold on to those differences and trying to make sure that even as I'm talking about Africans and Afro-descendant people, I couldn't just relay their experiences of Blackness together, like, okay, and they're Black and they have this color skin, and so this is the experience, right? I really had to go a little bit deeper than that. And so for me, this is where the scaffolding comes from, right? So the critical cartographies of racialization helps us to hold space for the different ways that anti-Blackness and the colonial difference imbue former colonies and contemporary metropoles. This relational cartography of racialization for Afro-diasporic peoples outlines the unfixed, racial, ethnic, ontological, and phenomenological experiences that emerge in moving across spatial and temporal locales. So really, I wanted to think about the ways that your subjectivity as a racialized person can change depending on where you are, right? And that becomes an important part of trying to mark something rather than trying to have a static understanding of who we are in particular spaces, which we can have for ourselves, but we also have to experience that we are our subject in the world, right? Okay, so I have this kind of larger project. I'm thinking about the critical targets of racialization. I am thinking through decolonial feminisms. I'm thinking through women of color feminisms, thinking through feminist philosophy, and trying to figure out how I can bring together these works so that they can tell me and tell us something, right? So I begin the book by talking about relations and really outlining the kind of long histories and the kinds of ways that I'm building on these Black feminists and women of color feminist understandings of relationality, the archipelagos, the mapping, which is what I just did. And then I opened the book with this chapter on intimacies, which is specifically looking at how the coloniality of occupation, of dictatorship, this coloniality of intimacy becomes such an important part of the lives of Equatorial Guineanos and Afro-Latinx Caribbean folks, right? And I'm specifically looking at the ways that these structures of power from afar are able to impact in a quote, post-colonial context are able to impact the most intimate parts of the lives of these folks, right? And so I'm looking at 3 different texts, one in the Dominican Republic, looking at a Black peasant woman who engages in forms of erotic and corporeal freedom. And then there I'm building on the work of Nadia Celis Salgados and her work, La Rebelión de las Niñas, El Caribe y la Conciencia Corporal, so thinking through corporeal consciousness, as well as building on the work of Jessica Marie Johnson's understanding of Black femme freedom, right? And thinking about the ways that although these structures of power try to circumscribe every aspect of our lives, what we see in a series of these works is Black women using their erotic autonomy, their corporeal consciousness to move up and against power with their bodies and putting their desires at the fore. I also looked at the first LGBTQ novel in Guinea Equatorial, which is called La Bastarda by Melibea, Trifonia Melibea Obono, which is also happens to be the first book translated into English by a woman from Equatorial Guinea. And it's translated as La Bastarda also, and it's by the Feminist Press. And in that book, what we see is a kind of critique from within the Fang community of the kind of double juncture, the kind of bringing together of both colonial patriarchy and compulsory heterosexuality, along with the kind of indigenous, right, homophobia and the kind of violence against queer people. And in this novel, what we see is the building of a particular kind of consciousness and awakening of one's sexuality from the perspective of this young girl who is understood to be a bastarda. And then this move, right, away from a community into the forest with a kind of collective of other queer and disabled and otherwise outcast people. And so it becomes this really important kind of landmark novel that has brought the author much grief in writing it because of the way in which it critiques, right? Not just the kind of colonial order, which is what so many of the novels do, but critiquing the kind of plan that's in power at the moment, right? And the kind of practices that have foreclosed so many possibilities for queer people in Guinea Equatorial. And then I look at a novel from Anobon, looking at the long histories of neglect and the impact that dictatorship can have from very, very far away, and the ways that Black women and girls are often at the forefront, right, of attempting to lessen that gap of need and fear, and often have to put their bodies on the line, right, to think about these intimacies. So for me, I was really interested in opening up this book and thinking about, these are all the ways that these works are thinking about intimacy. These are the ways that they're thinking about US occupation, about dictatorship. There's so much going on in every single one of the novels. They're all so different. And if this is what's happening in this body of literature, who is seeing it? Who is reading these works, right? To learn, to see, to imagine differently how we can engage with these structures of powers that impact our everyday lives. And so I moved on there to think about witnessing and what does it mean to bear witness, and really building on the work of feminist philosophers, particularly decolonial feminist philosophers like Maria Lugones, and taking up her kind of meditation on faithful witnessing and expanding it to think about witnessing both in juridical and religious terms, so looking at 2 texts and looking at the ways that not only do the writers engage in acts of witnessing and bearing witness to dictatorship, to religious colonization, bearing witness to gender violence, but also, you know, the writers are doing this through their characters, the writers are allowing us to see it, but that we as readers have a duty, right? They're asking us to pay attention, to bear witness also, right? To learn from what it is that we're seeing, or at least to throw our hands, right, into the mix in some way. And so for me, this idea of witnessing is not just a kind of philosophical question. It's not just an approach to thinking differently about recognition in, you know, post-continental philosophy. It's not just an anti-Hegelian form of thinking that kind of goes against agonistic recognition, but one that actually posits a different kind of ethical position, right? A different kind of take that says, actually, communities of color, Black and Indigenous women have always borne witness to one another, have borne witness and been able to step in the fray for others, been able to step in, to speak, to fight, to love on behalf of one another, and that is an action, and it's a required action as part of any kind of decolonizing politic, not just to see, right? Not just to recognize what's happening, not just to witness from afar, but to be a faithful witness means that you put yourself on the line of danger, right? You put yourself in that action. And so for me, that became an important part of thinking about not only just the kind of hermeneutic practice of witnessing, but the everyday practice of witnessing in any kind of decolonizing politic. And I have a question at the end of that chapter, which is like, if witnessing is the first thing, right? Like if it's one of the first things that you need to do in order to engage in any kind of decolonizing practice, you need to be able to see power, see the abuses of power, these structures. Then what is one of the first things that we need to bear witness to? And for me, it is this third chapter here, Destierro, where I kind of develop this concept of destierro as a way to think through the complexities of diaspora and exile and other forms of diasporic dislocation that we might not have quite the words to it. And so for me, it was clear that decolonial thought had not necessarily had too much work on diaspora studies. It was a big part of me that was leaning on post-colonial thought. But for me, I found myself really drawn to this passage in Achille Vejas's novel, Days of Awe, where she was talking about destierro as being different than exile, as destierro being the act of being forcefully torn from the earth, right? It's a different thing altogether. And I started to kind of imagine what it would mean for us to conceive of destierro as not just a metaphysical condition, but a historical condition, right? So if we know that the modern capitalism is contingent on the dispossession of lands and dispossession of people from those lands and the movement of different people onto the lands of dispossessed people to work and to labor on it, then what we have is this entanglement, this palimpsest of folks who have been desterrados, who have been torn from the lands onto other places, right? And that are forced to contend with that. And that becomes a very tense and tender, difficult ground to stand on, right? In particular, and I'm not just thinking about the kind of physicality of being pulled away from land, but I'm also thinking about destierro as being torn away from our languages, from our foods, from our cultures, from our particular kinds of spiritual practices, right? For those who have become denigrated, right? To have become part of a past that was seen as ahistorical. And at the same time, I didn't want us to conceive of destierro as only this negative, as only this being torn away from homelands and cultures and languages and practices, but also the other side, which is a constant fight towards, right, reclaiming, holding on, making space and making known, right, one's claim to a particular kind of space, language, practice, or lands. And then the next thing about destierro for me was important. It was that it's not just enough for us to understand our own destierro, right? To understand our own long histories of dispossession, but that in order to really think through destierro, we have to understand one another's, right? Experiences with destierro. So being able to see each other across these kinds of divides. And so I was really pushed to think about this, in particular, looking at discourses around Black and Indigenous reparations, which is where I move into the next chapter, right? Which thinking about what does it mean for someone like me, who's an Afro-Puerto Rican, right? Like living in the continental United States, knowing that I do have a homeland that is not here, that is not North America. My histories of enslavement are not here. My Indigenous histories are not here. And yet I am sitting and engaging with very difficult conversations and listening to really like listening hard to conversations around Black and Indigenous reparations. And oftentimes the way that there is these kind of moments that they don't meet, these kind of incommensurable moments, right? And so I talk in the book about being at a conference and people, talking about experiences, being in organizing circles, and someone saying, when it comes to Black and Indigenous reparations, well, the Black folks can have the mule, but the 40 acres are ours, right? They belong to Indigenous people. Or when we're thinking about something like the kind of protests that were happening after 2008 in the Bay Area, we're looking at, there's another example that comes out of Indigenous women's work that talks about Black folks accusing Indigenous folks of trying to displace Black people in order to take those homes, right? And so what we see is these rapid contentions when we're engaging in reparations and ideas about reparations in the terms in the framework of the state itself that has done the harm. So for me, this question of destierro leads to reparations, right? How do we repair something that is so deeply embedded, so deeply entangled that we can very easily misunderstand each other. We can missee each other, right? We're not gonna be able to bear witness to one another. And so for me, the question was about what does reparations look like outside of the material? So like, and not just outside of like, I don't want your money, but outside of the material in that, how do we understand it in addition to, right, to material reparations? So once we are able to agitate and organize toward reparations, how do we understand reparations in understanding one another? And so I was tracking the ways that these works were contending with reparations, oftentimes falling into very similar pitfalls of capitalism, but then also looking at the ways that oral histories and traditional storytelling became part of thinking about reparations in different ways. And so we don't just necessarily have to inherit the kinds of reparations of the capitalist modernity, but in fact, we have in our own communities and our own practices understandings of reparations that are far beyond, right, what the limited scope of reparations that we're given. And so part of this chapter of reparations is really a question of, engaging in a reparation of the imagination, thinking differently about the possibilities of what can be for us, right? What liberation can look like, but also reparations as a decolonial love, right? Which I'll talk a little bit about later. I talk a little bit about that kind of question of reparation of the imagination as I move into the last chapter, Apocalypso, which is one that is looking at the ways that Afro-Atlantic diasporic peoples, Afro-Latinx and Afro-Hispanophone folks are thinking about futurities and are actually practicing futurities. And that chapter is split in two. And so the first half, I'm looking at Lukumi and Afro-Cuban Santeria as it emerges in the young adult novel and also in the music, the album by the Afro-Cuban French twins in Ibegi, and tracking both the young adult novel and the album and its videos, its images, to look at the ways that they are conjuring and thinking about temporality and spatiality in different ways, the way that they're hailing on longer practices of elegies, the ways in which these particular kinds of practices allow us to understand the value of our ancestors, not just to the present, not just to the past, but it's integral to our futures, right? The ancestors guide us towards the futures that we want. That these forms of remembrance practices radically work against the long histories of dispossession, enslavement, and genocide that said that our ancestors don't matter whatsoever, right? But that in fact that their Black lives mattered then, now, and in the future. I'm really thinking about their practices as this kind of future work, right? These ritual practices that are oftentimes understood and kind of relegated in modernity as, something that is, hasn't moved forward, is not modern, is right, is the kind of this kind of relic, this vestige of a kind of pre-modern past is actually what allows us to conjure up different kinds of futures. And then the second part of that chapter looks at how these writers, in particular two writers, in a short story and a novel, are thinking about the destruction of ecology, the destruction of the sea. They're looking at, climate change, and particularly looking at it from the perspective of islands, the folks who are first going to feel and are first already feeling, right, the impacts of this climate disaster that we're facing, and the ways that both ecology and these kinds of practices will first kind of ricochet, kind of like what Amy Cesar calls a boomerang effect, right, of colonization, right, this kind of long effect that not just impacts folks on the underside of the modern project, but actually this kind of destruction of the earth is coming directly back towards the kind of colonial orders and the modern orders. And so I was really just kind of fascinated by the dual ways that folks were thinking about futurities, both as spirituality and then also these like apocalyptic futures. And I move on from there to the kind of closing of the book, which is the sea, where I talk a little bit about how the sea and water come up across each of the chapters. I look at a series of poems by Equatorial Guinean and Afro-Puerto Rican poets, and then look at the cover art, which is here that you see. It is by Afro-Cuban visual artist Maria Magdalena Campos Ponce de las Dos Aguas. And I kind of end with a meditation on these pieces and how these works allow us to think about every single one of these different kind of concepts and chapters that have been happening in decolonizing diasporas. The entire project kind of builds through and thinks about decolonial love as something that propels both me through the project, but also thinking about what kind of work is necessary and what is it that we need to fuel us for the work of decolonization and liberation in like our actual like lived lives and in our writing and in our imaginations. And so I have two quotes here. Decolonial love as future work envisaged through our past is necessarily a technology for social transformation, which is a quote from Chela Sandoval, and as a method through which we can reimagine human being as praxis, building on thinking through the work of Sylvia Wynter. And then finally, decolonial love manifests as attentions of 1492, the past before, the past since, the subterranean roots created by it, and the dead beneath the sea. It can be imagined as looking into the vast and inconsolable sea to make visible what was disappeared and make perceptible futurities beyond colonization. And so this is kind of where I move towards, right? What brings me through the book and how I continue to build on decolonial love as a practice and also as a technology, right? So from here, I want to talk a little bit about, so I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about what it means to think through Black feminist thought across genres, because one of the things that propelled my work was the thinking about, was thinking through and with Black feminist writers, both across the diaspora, but also across genres of writing, and using those works, novels, poetry, music, right? Speeches, essays, as ways to orient the book itself. So rather than me trying to take up, for example, decolonization and try to use that as a lens to then place on every novel and be like, well, how can you tell me how to decolonize? What can you show me, right? Really thinking about how the novels both push back and help us think differently, how all these works, music, poetry, help us think differently through this. And I have this photo here of the this conference that was organized in February 2020, so right before the pandemic, in UT Austin. It was Black Women's Intellectual Contribution in the Americas, and it was organized by the Site Black Women Collective at the Lilla Benson Center. And it was an incredible opportunity to have Black women from all over Latin America and the Caribbean in the US in relationship to like US African-American feminists. And other, you know, the kind of conference itself was across 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And it was this kind of earth-shattering moment in which we were able to talk to one another, to engage one another. And also folks were coming in across a broad swath of experiences as organizers, as activists, as writers, as artists, right, as teachers. And for me, this had become this kind of incredible moment in which this idea of just reading and thinking through Black feminist work across genres shifted to this kind of in-person kind of friction, right? This kind of an incredible experience. And I wanted to talk about that move from both like us reading to then the action of engaging one another. And also consider in this context, thinking about Latin America and thinking about how this photo is very different than the kind of hegemonic perspectives on Latin American feminism, right? Or quote unquote Latina feminism that we often see, right? So we know that the majority of Black people outside of Africa are in Latin America, right? In Brazil, in Colombia, the US has the 3rd highest amount, the Caribbean is, right? And yet and still, in the ways that we think about our Latinidad and we think about our Latina feminisms and our Latina scholarship, often erases, obfuscates, or just uses Black Latinas as a token, right? As a token, you know, just an addition, you know, just a, oh, by the way, right? They exist here. And so I really wanted to think about how we are in this moment, shifting and on shifting ground. And really urge us to think differently about how we conceive of Latinidad, how we conceive of Blackness in our communities, in our kinship circles, and in the kinds of resources and opportunities that we have to extend to one another. So I wanted to think about that. So then I wanted to shift from here in terms of thinking about Black feminism across genre. And again, I have here, what's really interesting is I have these kind of texts at the bottom. It's like a Dominican writer, Afro-Puerto Rican, Eritrean writer, Afro-Puerto Rican writer, Black Cuban sisters, right? Guineanas, right? And all this way in which we can build our work with Black women and Black Latinas. It is possible, but not only that, it is necessary, right? Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this project Taller Electric Marronage, which I founded with my comadre, Jessica Marie Johnson, who's a historian, who's also actually Afro-Puerto Rican, African-American historian from Chicago. And so in cahoots with Jessica Johnson, we created Electric Marronage as a place for us to bring together digital and material practices in the digital humanities, one that took community first, right? So it's a shift to community informed digital humanities practices and thinking about what is it that our communities, our kin, our students want to see and want to do, and how do we bring that, right, to the digital? How do we share this in these larger contexts? I think when we started this in 2018, we didn't launch it until 2020, in the spring of 2020. And we had no idea that COVID would bring a whole new element, right, to how we were doing this work. And so I'm gonna share some of the things that we've done, but I'm really interested in kind of sharing both the kind of scope of the work, and also, and I'm gonna share one more slide here, and I'll show you a little bit of the website in a second, but also the ways that we're able to engage with students and with community members and also with junior scholars. Dr. Johnson has been organizing like interviews with different artists and organizers. We have a library, a fugitive handbook, right? Really thinking through the questions of marronage and these 4 rules in ways that encapsulate so many of the ways that we not only need to escape sometimes the kind of quote unquote ivory tower, but also trying to help one another figure out how, right? How do we enact forms of survival in institutions that really que nos quieren exprimir, you know, that really want to take every single thing out of us. The way that that I work through Electric Marronage through the MSU side is through the Afro-Latinx Lab. And one of the things I started to do last year in particular with the pandemic was to kind of bring invited folks who did Afro-Latinx studies across a broad like swath of disciplines and practices to my classroom in Introduction to Black Studies, right? And so with my students' permission, we would invite these folks in and we recorded, right, those sessions where the speaker would talk to them and the students would respond in the kind of questions, because so much of our pedagogy is hidden from one another, right? So much of that is often just like sequestered into the classroom itself. And so we often don't get the opportunity to teach the kinds of things that we love and the things that we know will be so important to our communities within community spaces, right? Or we don't get to share and glimpse those things. And so one of the things that we did was this with the Afro-Latinx Lab. The other thing that we did was to create a 4-week bomba class online. And so what we did was we were able to connect with Bombazo Dance Co., who taught online bomba classes. And so my students in Introduction to Black Studies were learning the most, the oldest, you know, extant African dance, right? In the Caribbean, in the New World, right? In the Caribbean, they were learning bomba for 4 weeks, but that these classes were also open to the public globally. They were open to their families, to communities. And so what we would have is classes full of young undergraduate students with elders, with children, with people from Scotland, from Puerto Rico, from, you know, all over the Caribbean, from Ireland, and coming into dance together, right? In this kind of moment for 4 weeks. So rather than do like a one-hit wonder, we did like a whole 4-week class. And for us, that became a really important part of that practice of bringing together this embodied practice of bomba, which, by the way, there's this really incredible young scholar, Sara Bruno, who is doing work on embodied affect and bomba, which, you know, her work is incredible, and hopefully her book will come out soon. But also thinking about how we share, right, across these networks. And then we also had this exhibit, this digital exhibit. We had wanted to bring in artists in residence in spring 2020. They were supposed to come in March, Jose Arturo Valles del Panelli, to do an exhibit called El Caribe Fractal at MSU. And so we were going to set him up in a gallery and for him to be in residence for a few weeks and to work with students. But obviously the pandemic hit. And so what we did is that we reconvened in the fall and we put together a digital exhibit with this technology. And I'm going to just exit really quick to show you a different screen. We were able to, here we go, work with an exhibit called Ableize. So this is the Bomba event, and these are some of the many conversations and many events that we had at Electric Marronage, with the solidarities events. And you can see that we have these 4 rules: how do you escape, how do you steal, what does it feel like, and whatever. And each one of these will take you to a different set of works. And then we also have our blog, our mood board, our library podcast. It is really just an incredible work of love, and we work with incredible students. So this is and I'm just gonna refresh this really quickly so you can see what we did with this digital exhibit. And so what we did was a 2-part exhibit, was both the Caribe Fractal with Jose Arturo Ballester, where he did Caribbean fractals. And we also did, on the ends of this was the En Tiempos de Pandemia, where he went and he was in community with folks who were houseless during the pandemic, and really thinking about what it means to fall fuera de la burbuja, outside of the bubble of the pandemic, right? And not just working as a photographer, but also as a community member, bringing food, bringing 3 meals a day outside to folks who had, who were like in the streets, and also engaging folks in conversation, right? Building on the work that had been done during Huracán Maria, and particularly the work that Festival de la Palabra was doing that was called No Estás Solo. So what was really interesting, so here at the end, we have the pandemia videos, and so we can see here. So I'm going to put these links in the chat when the talk is over, so that I can show you a little bit, so you can kind of look at the gallery yourself. One of the things that was important in terms of thinking about the pandemic, from the perspective of Puerto Rico, from the perspective of Jose Arturo Ballester as an artist, was thinking about the folks who are kind of most on the periphery. Again, right? The question of the periphery comes in again. Who falls outside of, right, this question? And so we were able to bring this together, not only physically in the gallery, but then use Ableize technology, which is a technology that allows folks with visual disabilities to engage in art. So engaging with this company then allowed us to do this digital exhibit, which I think will continue, right? And so I think we were really excited about the way that the pandemic allowed us to engage differently with publics that we wanted to reach anyway, but also our kind of community orientation and our orientation to like research and curation also helped us navigate the new digital realm. It's always about accessibility, right? It's always about, it's not just to be thrown up on the internet for internet's sake, but also who are we reaching and who is being connected with. As part of that, I just wanted to kind of end the talk a little bit in terms of talking about where I'm moving now with my projects, which is Archive of Disappearances, looking at Afro-Puerto Ricans at the edges of empire, and specifically looking at how Afro-Puerto Ricans are both erased from the archive, erased from our national histories and patrimonies, but also become excessive of, right, are hyper visible as this kind of folkloric other, right? And so for me, I'm really interested both in the ways that the colonial archive serves to oftentimes erase Afro-Puerto Ricans and particular kinds of details and claims that Afro-Puerto Ricans have to, for example, land, space, one another, the way that the census moves and dictates race differently across the board. But I'm also interested in kind of these alternative and digital archives, looking at photography projects, looking at film, looking at digitized oral history projects, and then working on my end to build projects to be able to allow these to be more accessible to folks. So you can hear something like Frank Espada's, the Puerto Rican Diaspora Project interviews that he did from 1979 to 1983. I think he did over 80 interviews. And so I'm in the process of digitizing those interviews and having them available on a repository online, so that folks can hear, right, the kind of question that he had, which is, what is the survival of a people? And so I'm really interested in is, what is the survival of Afro-Puerto Rican peoples? What do these stories say? And how do we find ourselves against the grain of a colonial and imperial order that would seek to erase us? How do we find ourselves in these other places, including these kind of photography and film projects? And just to make a very long story short, this project began as a task that was given to me of my family to find some of our records in Vega Baja, Puerto Rico, and I was not able and not allowed to access those files. And for me, it was really frustrating. And months later, I was watching these films, watching Living Los Sures, watching Delivered Vacant, which are two films that look at Puerto Rican life in South Brooklyn and one in Hoboken, where I grew up. And it was really surprising to me to see, for example, in the photo that I have here of these young men on the cars, the kind of the young man that is like closest to the camera is actually my cousin Danny. So I'm not able to find my family in Puerto Rico, right? In the church archives and et cetera. But here I am sitting and watching this film and having this uncanny moment where I'm like, this is so, like, he just looks so, right? And my cousin being like, where'd you find that picture of Danny, right? Like, where'd you find that photo of my cousin who's now passed away? The same thing in Delivered Vacant when I'm looking into the long histories of these arsons in Hoboken, vis-a-vis, for example, the arsons that we know that happened in the South Bronx, right? That we know very well. The arsons in Hoboken happened a decade later. And I had gifted this film to my sister because my sister is the first Latina firefighter in Hudson County and the first Latina captain in the state of New Jersey. And I gifted her this film, Delivered Vacant, because then it was a documentary about the arsons. And we were watching it and I saw my aunt Blanca, right? funnily enough, being paid off to leave after her building was burned down, right? And so in that moment, for me, it became this incredible, uncanny and exciting moment to think about where Afro-Puerto Ricans emerge in other ways, right? And how we can kind of think about both these projects that are both material and digital to reach different kinds of histories, to understand our own cartographies differently, our own geographies of being and our own places, right? In these new ways. And so I think that's all I have. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Wow, you are brilliant. I mean, everything that you've just, covered so many things. And I know we're like having a conversation in the back with our team. We're like, and this is hitting home and this is hitting home and it's just so fascinating. Congratulations and thank you for, first of all, congratulations. Thank you for doing this work because I know that this is exactly for what you just said at the end, right? It starts from this thing that is so personal. I really appreciate how you started with these images of like your personal history, like where you graduated from, all the information about your family, and closing it down with this whole idea of how your history is out there, but yet you can't access it, right? You can't access these records, and it's really infuriating. We see that parallel with a lot of the work that we also do here at the recovery program with records for the Latino community, who a lot of times are featured or seen in documentaries, right? Yet the family has no record of like their family's histories because that has never been part of an archive, like a formal archive per se. Yet it can be commodified, right, for other purposes. So I can just say that I don't know what that feels like, but I certainly respect that, and I thank you for sharing that with our community here. Well, I mean, congratulations. Let me go ahead. Let's look at some of the chat. See if I have a couple of questions prepared, but is there anything else that you want to add before we jump in, Yomaira? I know that you were. Well, I look at the chat really quickly, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to add them into the chat, or also feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, definitely feel free to ask a question. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone for being here. And thank you so much for your comments. And yeah, it's like an exciting time and to be doing like a different kind of project. And when I went into graduate school, I went into the Ph.D. program where with the idea that I was going to do I was going to do a project specifically on Afro-Puerto Rican like literature and Afro-Puerto Rican experiences. And then like it just se me like, no sé, aprendí tantas cosas, you know what I mean? Like you learn all these new things, and el proyecto se me fue a un sitio como like transatlantic, hemispheric, and it's really exciting. Y después de un momento veo que ahora estoy volviendo a lo que yo estaba haciendo, you know, like hace 15 años, you know, like, and so it's really exciting to be able to do this and to do it with a different perspective and do it with a completely different set of ethics, right? Because I think going, and one of the things I tell my grad students is when I was going into grad school, like no one could tell me that Puerto Ricans weren't the most oppressed people on the planet, you know? I was like, no, es que ustedes no entienden, we're like, you know, we're just so oppressed because it's because lo otro. And then all of a sudden, you know, I'm learning all of these different histories. And that, for me, that kind of question of relationality became not just a question of like research, but also one, it was like, okay, who are you and how are you engaging with others, right? How are you engaging with other histories? And that engagement really shifted me. So I'm really happy to be doing this project now with a completely different understanding of the ways that these histories connect with one another, right? Because it just allows us to do things different. So anyway, I guess ánimo for anyone who like paused on a project and is, you know, wondering when they're gonna get back to it.
Yeah, and I also want, I think it's interesting and it's important to touch on the fact that, like, you know, that we talk about timing for some of these projects, like even for us here at the recovery program, right? Some of the work that we were doing at the very beginning was just to document and to locate some of these items. But now through the use of digital humanities, now we're actually like able to bring to fruition some of the initial goals, which were to really put these items into the hands of the community. And I see how one of the strongest elements in the contemporary renditions of your work is this like powerful involvement of the community, right? With La Bomba, these exhibits that like place you right into the space where like you're also training students, and you know it's just really empowering to see how these archives that are supposedly like not accessible to the everyday people, you're taking them like right into like the hands, right, of the people, and how you are imagining, you know, bringing this is what we also talk about here at USLDH, where we take like the academic work and put it into the hands of the community, right? And otherwise our work is, I don't know, I feel like our work is meaningless otherwise. I mean, that's more of a comment.
Yeah, and you know, I think one of the things was I had always been interested in DH work from a very far away, and it wasn't until I really started engaging in conversations with my colleague and partner, Jessica Marie Johnson in Electric Marronage, who has, like I said, is Afro-Puerto Rican and African-American from Chicago, who works on New Orleans, whose book Wicked Flesh is just incredible. But her work as someone who's like basically a senior scholar in DH really helped me think differently about what DH can do. And she is like, you know, far light years ahead of whatever I can do, right? But that the little bits that I have learned from engaging her and her work and her colleagues in DH have allowed me to take the kind of community and organizing orientation that I've always had to then shift it and to learn different ways and different modes of accessibility. And so for me, that has been important, which is why I feel like it's so important for us to engage with folks across a series of different disciplines and practices, because we learn, right? We learn how to be better at what we do by engaging with others with all these different skill sets, and actually can really change. Like we can change ourselves, right? By engaging these kinds of folks. And so for me, I think I just wanted to kind of point that out, because I think that's important to kind of put on the floor. Like I learned this through another Black Latina, right? Yeah. Who was doing this work, not necessarily from anyone else that was doing DH that was around me, who weren't really talking in the same kinds of terms. I was like, okay, so you do techie things. All right, you know, like, ¿qué tiene eso que ver con la abuela? You know what I mean? Like, and so, yes, I just wanted to add that,
Yeah. And I really like how you walked us through the different elements of your book, like the intimacies, and then I want to go back to this the decolonial love, which I think is just really like powerful. If you could talk a little bit about how that looks. I think you call us into into a lot of action, because you say it's not just about like, you know, enacting like the decolonial, but it's also doing the practice and like the technology.
Yeah.
Can you talk
Yeah,
a little bit more about that? Yeah.
No, for sure. Yeah, I think I've always been intrigued by this question of decolonial love, in particular because we know that like both love and rage, or love and fury, fuels so much of our movements, right? Fuels so much of our political action. And that's not to be conflated with the kinds of love that people declare in order to do hateful things, right? I was having this conversation with colleagues last week. It's like, what is love? Like, what is love as action, right? And so I was thinking about decolonial love as not just the kind of love that fuels a revolution, but also a love that looks and takes up questions of relationality, right? Of, like, not just your revolution, what is it in relation to someone else? And also looks at the past as instructive to the future and to the present, right? So again, like these kinds of things, they come to us, and they are parts of the kind of larger meditation of the book, but also in our lives. Like, how do we engage? And how do we engage in acts of decolonial love with one another, right? Like, if as Chela Sandoval, it's a technology for social transformation, how do we engage in social transformation, and how do we put that love into action, not just written in a book, right? And one of the examples, there's a few examples in the book of what decolonial love can look like, and it's not always like a utopic thing, right? Oftentimes it's very painful, and it is a sacrifice many times. But one of the things that I was in the chapter on reparation, for example, I was looking at Ernesto Quiñones's Bodega Dreams, and looking at this kind of titular character of Willy Bodega, and his idea that his reparations of Spanish Harlem are going to be, it's like so completely like built on a kind of capitalist notion. He's like, I'm going to be like the Kennedys, and we're going to get to the White House, and we're going to buy the block, and then we're going to get the young Puerto Rican and Latinx kids on the block. They're going to live in the buildings, and we're just going to own it. We're just going to start buying shit block by block, right? And it all falls apart because he's thinking about it within this kind of schema of a game that we can't win, right? Like, it's not even meant for you to play, right? But what happens at the end, this kind of move, this kind of protagonist, Chino, right, is at the beginning like, I can't wait to get out of Spanish Harlem. I hate this. These people are, you know, he's like a young first generation college kid. He's, you know, he's married to this like Pentecostal girl. There's all types of shenanigans going on in the novel, which I talk about in the book. But for me, I was really interested in that kind of shift that happens at the end around the question of language, and the way that he begins to both like love himself, and also love his neighbors and his kin and his community in a way that he was not having at the beginning of the novel, right? At the beginning of the novel, he was like, I can't stand any of these people. I can't wait to get out of here, right? I just, you know, whatever. And then at the end, and he's like, oh, wow, this whole language, like, you know, there's like a kind of exit where he's kind of like in a kind of dream state, and he's listening to someone's like, oh, mira, vete pa la bodega and don't go to the rufo, right? Like, and he's like, oh my gosh, like this language is love, right? And then he runs into an old man, Hipólito, and a grandson, and Hipólito's looking for the famed Willy Bodega who's been murdered, right? And he's like, I'm looking for Willy Bodega because people tell me that Willy Bodega will help me get settled in. And he's like, I'll help you. I'll do it. Like, don't you come with me, right? Like, don't worry about it. And so for me, that becomes a moment, like just like a small snippet, right, of what that could look like when you begin to undo. There's a line in the brief one of Oscar Wilde where Junot Díaz says something like, Belicia, what did you know about diaspora? And what did you know about the kind of self-hate that would short circuit your children's brains, right? And that moment of that self-hate being like, oh, wait, I love me, and I love these people, and I love this language, and I'm going to extend myself to the other without any like need, right? Like, he's like, Hipólito's promising me all these things. I said, don't worry about it. You know what I mean? And so for me, that became a moment in which the novel itself helped me to understand a little bit of what decolonial love can look like, and where I've seen it, in my own community, in my own family, in real life, right? And so for me, you know, I opened the book with thinking about Sylvia Wynter and the way that she talks about literature as transformative, right? It's a kind of umbrella system for the transformation of the human sciences, the study of humanitatis. And I've always thought about the ways that like novels and literature, when you take them seriously, do have the possibility to really shift the way that we think about ourselves in the world, right? And so for me, that's the kind of impetus to kind of look and read and lean into the book to feel and to know how I can think differently, right? Like, I think that's kind of the gift that they can give us.
That's awesome. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions. Claudia Espinosa is going to ask her question.
Hi, everyone. I just have a really quick question. So first of all, thank you so much for having this conversation. I think it was very helpful. It's very useful. So just a really quick background, I work for the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. So we have a direct relation to the community, and we depend on the community, right, to build our archive, to build our collection. So with that being said, we are very new. And so, and I'm just kind of listening to what you were saying about like that image you found, right? And it's like, how did you have an image of my cousin? And we don't even have that image. So I guess my question is, if you could offer any advice or some words of wisdom, what would those words of wisdom be for us to reach out to the community and make sure that we are bridging that gap?
You know, I am really in awe of the work that librarians and archivists do. It is above me in a way that I can't even express to you. You know what I'm saying? Like, I got mad love for all the kinds of work that you do. And I think that, again, I learned about the work of radical librarianship through Jessica Johnson. I just feel like this is like the Jessica Johnson hour. I see you here too, Jessica Johnson, you in here somewhere. And so I think that there are probably, and I know for a fact that there are networks of, for example, like radical Black librarians who are doing cool work. I have like a former student who's like doing her master's in library science right now. She's like got like a little clique. And I think that engaging with other folks who are doing that work, that direct to community work, becomes so important because you can learn from the kinds of connections that they're making. I don't know. I mean, for me, I think about it as access, community access to spaces, welcoming folks to these places. And so I think so many folks see a building. I mean, not so many. I mean, I think it's different. But for me, growing up, like the library was not necessarily a welcoming place. And going to the library didn't really. It was like, if you can't really afford a book, then you can't really get a book. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it was like my family didn't really have that connection to the library in that way that we knew to go there and you can get stuff. Like, that wasn't really what was going on, you know? And then when we did go, it was like exceptional, like it was like, whoa, you know? And so I often think about that in relationship to other folks who I knew who grew up with lots of access to these kinds of places. So I'm wondering about like the kinds of outreach, home visits, open houses. I know it's a pandemic, but activities for children, for seniors, right? For like all different kinds of folks, so they can feel like that place is a place for them. So they feel like confident enough, or not even confident, but trust enough that this kind of institution is a community institution, not just one that's there to kind of collect and take whatever they got, right? But one that's always in relationship with them. So, I mean, you can even ask, you know, one of the first things that I learned about organizing is that the first thing that you have to do is ask the community what they need and what they want, right? Like that's what the Young Lords did. That's what the Black Panthers did. Mayo did, right? Like folks are like, what is it that you need, right? And so for me, the kind of best example to think about for me is like the Young Lords, where they're like, we're revolutionaries, we're gonna do this thing, it's gonna be so radical. And they're like, what can we do? And they were like, you need to pick up the garbage. There's garbage everywhere. And they're like, oh, okay, great. My revolutionary idea is gonna pick up garbage. So you never know, who knows what the community might ask, you know, you guys to do. But that is the kind of buildup of relationships. So that's what I would say, but I will also say like, someone else who's in that same, you know, in your same flow for some ideas. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
We have another question from Tila.
Hello, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this event, and I put it in the chat, but I'll just go ahead and expand more. And also, I just wanted to share that I learned about this opportunity through one of my classes at U of H, and so this has been amazing. And I am a Detroit, Michigan native, and also, and also a member of the Young Women's Advisory Council here in Houston, Texas, but we focus more on how to create accessibility within a community for, you know, different events as you were mentioning and how we can address certain social issues. So I just wanted to know what type of agenda that the MSC Women's Initiative has and
Yeah.
how you all address certain community issues.
Yeah, that. Okay, so I was part of the Women of Color Initiative when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. So Berkeley has the longest running Women of Color Initiatives project. It was like started in 1984. And then they run this huge conference every year, the Empowering Women of Color Conference. And I used to first organize with them, and then I used to run that conference before I came to MSU. And then I realized at MSU, we kind of needed something similar. So we started a Women of Color Initiatives there. And it's not the same, right? Like each institution has to have its own way of doing things. And so we couldn't, I obviously couldn't do a big mega conference like they did at Berkeley. They've been in existence for like 30 something years, right? So, but what we did at MSU was to kind of see how we can engage the students, both graduate students, undergraduate students, and also faculty and staff. We bring in one woman of color, writer, activist, organizer. We brought in like Alexis Polingum, Leanne Simpson, Elaine Castillo, Ana Castillo, Mayra Santos Febres. Like we brought in all these different, we were gonna bring in Letty Diem Thuy, a Vietnamese American writer, but the pandemic hit, so we're bringing her next year. And so we're really trying to engage folks. And then we also brought Nani Bachacon, who came in and did a mural in the community. But each part of those visits includes engagement outside of the campus itself, right? So for example, having like open mics in the community, ghost dinners or ghost suppers in the community, and different ways for us to engage with folks both in the institution and outside of the institution, and making sure that everything is open to the public. But for example, at Berkeley, it was a little bit different. So I don't know what it could look like at Houston. So at Berkeley, we had a committee. So we had one person that was in charge of it. And then we had a committee of folks who were students. And we also had elders in the community and just folks from all over the Bay Area who would come in every other Friday to have a meeting, and we would like feed everyone. And then those folks would help organize the conference. And because it was folks from inside and outside the university, we had connections to folks who were, artists and vendors and folks who were doing workshops and organizers, right? And so just a broad spectrum of different interests, right? At my undergrad institution at Rutgers, there was also Women of Color initiatives that got started right when I was leaving. And one of the things that they did was they did like a small reading group, like a once a month meetup, and we would read like a very short article, Like I remember my first time that we met together, we read like Sherry Moraga. Oh, I was like about to graduate, we read Sherry Moraga together. And then that spring semester, they did a symposium. And what they do every spring semester, they have a good small symposium with different folks. And so there's multiple ways that you can organize, particularly around women of color, and particularly thinking about like the kinds of ways that we have always been in community with one another and talking to one another about things that matter. But it's about trying to figure out what works in the space that you're in, and what are the kind of most important things like that are impacting your campus. Is it mental health? Is it physical or spiritual well-being? Is it kind of an opening to creative writing or to do some type of artistry? Is it about involvement in the community, right? Like, and try to figure out what exactly that is, and then build organically from there. You can't start like, we're gonna do this whole big thing, right? Like you have to go little by little, poquito a poco, right? Like just little by little, and build one step at a time. Yeah. Okay.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another comment. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very enlightening, exciting, and quite necessary. And this is from Folavo Ahaji Soyinka. And they have a question. It says, can you please expand a little bit more on how you use La Bomba dance as a teaching tool? I would also like to know about La Bomba dance epistemology.
Okay, but so I am not the most expert person I know on bomba, but I do know a lot. I know enough. I know enough to answer this question, I think. But I definitely would say that there are incredible scholars, and I'm gonna write them before I even answer the question. I'm gonna write them here. Sara Bruno, who's at Duke right now as an ACLS fellow, and then also Jade Power Sotomayor, who is at UCSD. Okay, so those are two people off the top of my head. Oh, and then also, sorry, Badia Rexach, who's in Puerto Rico, but actually she's a professor at San Diego State. And I actually have an article of hers in the Afro-Latinx Lab link that I put in. If you go to Barbara Abadia Rexach in the Afro-Latinx Lab, I think there's an article of her on bomba there. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with the bomba class was because we were online. So it's really funny because with a lot of the Women of Color initiatives organizing that I did in Berkeley, we had Aguacero and another bomba group, Tayel Tamborico from Puerto Rico, come into the Bay Area. And at MSU, I hadn't had the opportunity yet to bring bomba. And so the pandemic opened up this opportunity because I was talking to my students about embodied knowledge. We were talking about Afro-syncretic practices, right? And I really want to expand the way that they were thinking about the Black diaspora because it's an African-American studies course. And so they were originally thinking we're going to study only the United States. But instead we started in like the 14th century and we're moving through the kind of long history of colonization and racialization. And we're going to Caribbean and Latin America first, right? Like, because we know colonization exists for almost 150 years there before it moves up to North America. And the students are like, what is going on? Like, I did not know, like, this is not what I thought, And so we started to think about like, what are the kinds of knowledges and practices that get quote unquote left behind, right? What remains, right? In spite of all of these extreme, extraordinary violences that we've been learning about. And so talking about bomba is one thing and showing them a video is one thing, but them seeing the particular kind of practice and why it is, it's the oldest extant African like dance practice in the Americas, right? It is from Puerto Rico. And one of the things that we have is a series of different drummers. We have the dancers. We have the primary drummer, the kind of dancer and the drummer called the primo are in relationship to one another. The dancer, there's a series of different rhythms that you can dance. But once the dancer does her paseo, walks around and greets the drummers and begins to dance with the skirt or without the skirt, it really depends on the region and who's, the region and their particular practice of it. The dancer herself is the one who dictates the rhythm of the primo drum. That primary drum, he has to follow her. So it is a particular kind of shift from, and we could think about it as an epistemological shift around dancing, where as dancers in popular dance, we know that you follow the rhythm and can you be on beat? And in this dance, it is one in which the dancer herself tells the primo drummer how to go, and she can try to shake it up, right? She can go fast, she can go slow, she can move this way. And all the different dances, he has to watch her very careful and has to mark every single one of her moves. And for my students, it was really incredible to kind of rethink different forms of dance, right? And to think about this kind of enduring African dance and Afro-syncretic dance, what becomes a kind of Afro-Indigenous dance in Puerto Rico, and to then be able to practice something that is hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds years old, right? And then to be able to do that in 2021 online with their little cousin or their mom or whoever else in the house, right? Like doing these dances together. And it was an incredible moment. And not only were they learning it, and so we had like, so it's in some ways it's gendered, right? Like, or sex, in that there's like men's moves and women's moves, but the dancers and the instructors were very kind of forward thinking. And so they were like, this is this kind of move, this is this kind of move. And so what we had was people of all different bodies engaging in the dance in the ways that was most comfortable to their expression and their bodies. And it was really beautiful to see the students open up and to be able to dance both in like a bombazo circle together digitally, but also one-on-one, and the kinds of confidence that they built up from being able to do it from the first week when they're so shy to like the final week when they're like, ah, right? Like, and they're doing this thing. And so it's really incredible in terms of what that did for them. And I'm excited to be able to hopefully do that again in the future. But it was really and truly a gift to be able to do that with Milteri Tucker of Bombazo Dance Co, who's just incredible. And then she was like mailing skirts to the students, and some of the students had skirts. Like, it was great. So yeah.
That is so awesome. That's so empowering. These are just amazing examples of how, once you work with the community and you start, it really does shift a lot of epistemologies for them, especially with the digital humanities, right? Your whole observations on the maps, right? And how your place, being in a specific place can really help you shift identities and shift the way you think about, all of the different elements that make up your identity, right? Your race, your color, etc. All of these other elements. You have there's several comments celebrating this talk, congratulating you. We're gonna save the chat for you so that we can share it with you and you have that. is there, I know that we're getting close to the mark for for ending our session. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Yomaira?
I think, you know, the last thing you said made me think of something, which was, I've been recently in the book, I talk a little bit about the kind of ways that the tropes or the kind of concept of ni de aquí, ni de allá kind of flow and allow us to like understand the kind of belonging and always non-belonging of the diaspora, the non-belonging of quote unquote Latinidad, and also Blackness even within Latinidad. But recently I've been thinking about that a lot because, and thinking about the maps and the ways that you can see yourself articulate your place differently within different cartographies or different renderings of places that you have only ever seen as one thing, right? And then I thought about like, you know, what would it mean for us to claim, you know, soy de aquí y de allá, y de allá, y de aquí, y de allá. Soy de todos lados. You know what I mean? Like, and to kind of feel that place of belonging in all the places that you go, because you shifted from the kind of dominant perspective to like your own. So anyways, you just made me think about that. So that's been one of the things that's been on my mind.
Oh, can I jump in and say something? Because you
Yeah.
just made me think about the way in which people also say like, oh, I'm half this and half that for a quarter of this, a quarter of that. When like, why are we claiming percentages when those drop rules are a colonial practice, right? Like that's the same thing, right? And maybe like trying to claim, like reimagining it and claiming both places, spaces, and identities is part of that decolonial loving ourselves and making a space for us, or reimagining a space that does not use those colonial structures, right?
Yeah, thank you.
I love that. Soy de todos lados. I just love that so much. That's the hashtag for, that's, you know, and that should be the hashtag for Latinidad, because it really is, you know, you said something earlier in that really like hit the nail for the work that we do, which is the Latino community, the Hispanic community has been here since before this nation was, you know, created, right? The United States as a nation. We don't acknowledge a lot of the other communities that existed before that, but if we dig back, a lot of the times what comes out is the fact that we have been here for a long time, right? We have always been here, and we come from this idea of erasure and then trying to find our ways and find a way in which we fit in. But this, you know, turning it on upside down and saying, yeah, you know, yo pertenezco, ¿verdad? Yo soy de todos lados, would really like put us in a very different position of, you know, from which to enunciate ourselves, which I think is I think just what the gift that you've given us today, Yomaira. I am very grateful to you for your generosity, to, you know, for sharing space with us today. I know you're involved in your research right now, and I know that that can be, you know, hard, and we're coming at you right when you're supposed to be doing, you know, other stuff, and so we're grateful to you for that. Thank you very much to everyone who participated, who joined us today. Yes, un aplauso if you can, you know, unmute yourself and shout out thank you to Yomaira so she feels you, send your hearts. I know that Jessica is here too, Jessica Marie Johnson. I haven't had the pleasure to really talk to her in person or meet her, but I really love how we really are acknowledging that we are not doing this on our own. We're standing on the shoulders of many, many people who are still lending us their shoulders so that we can continue to advance this work for our communities. So thank you very, very much, Yomaira.
Thank you. Me vas a hacer llorar. That's so beautiful.
I mean, it's your work. I mean, really, and in the end, you know, one of the things that we always say, we realize that we have brothers and sisters across the US doing this important work. That's why we're using the hashtag, the USLDH. We know that if somebody messes with our brothers and sisters, and you know, and on the other side of the US, they're messing with the people that are doing this work here. So, you know, we're a big community, right? But that doesn't erase the different battles that we each have to fight on our own turfs. So we thank you all. We hope that that you've enjoyed this talk as much as we have. We will upload it to our YouTube channel in a few days when, when our team looks through it. And then of course, when Yomaira has a chance to look at it and approve it. And we hope everyone has a safe, rest of the semester. We, people who are in the path of this storm that is coming, we hope that you're safe and that you continue to be well in this pandemic. And I think that is all.
Yeah. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Stay safe,
Yomaira.
and thank you all for staying. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take
Nos
care,
vemos.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.